بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، وصلاتي وسلامي على سيدي ومولاي محمد بن عبد الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. حياكم الله وأهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم، وأهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بالدكتور أحمد كيلر والدكتور عبد الواحد الوكيل. وحقيقة يعني إحنا يعني سعداء جدا في بدء هذا العام بأننا نبدأ بالعمارة الغربية وعن الميزان في العمارة الغربية والإسلامية والمشهد المدني. وطبعا يعني الميزان هو الأساس في كل شيء، لأنه يعتبر فيه يعني نوع من التوازن والموازنة، قصدي في نوع من العدل يعني. وطبعا العدل في كل شيء مهم جدا في هذه الحياة الدنيا، ليس فقط في العمارة ولكن أيضا في عمارة الكون بصفة عامة، في عمارة القلوب بصفة خاصة. لذلك طبعا وخاصة في يعني ونحن على مشارف العام الهجري الجديد الذي بنيت فيه الدولة الإسلامية من بعد الهجرة. وطبعا الأخ الكريم الدكتور عبد الواحد يعرف ذلك، وقد يعني ساهم مساهمة كبيرة في عمارة المسجد الأول الذي بني من بعد الهجرة هو مسجد قباء. فالحقيقة أنا سعيدة جدا بهذه المعاني كلها مجتمعة بأن تكون في هذه الندوة. وطبعا الدكتور عبد الواحد يعني يكون هو مدير لهذه الجلسة، ولكن أردت أن أرحب بكم وأرحب بهما، وإن شاء الله يعني تكون محاضرة جميلة ومتوازنة وعامرة أيضا بناء على العمارة. تفضل دكتور عبد الواحد، شكرا جزيلا لك. أنا عائشة المناعي، مديرة مركز محمد بن حمد الثاني لإسهامات المسلمين في الحضارة، وعميدة كلية الدراسات الإسلامية بجامعة حمد بن خليفة. شكرا جزيلا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا أحب أن نشكر الدكتورة عائشة شخصيا على دعوة صديقي أحمد كيلر. To speak in English so that you know I'm a good friend. In 1980 I established myself in England, and one day I find Paul, alias Ahmed, and another friend of his, Peter Ismail, who unfortunately died while making a new transliteration of the Quran. He spoke 22 languages and was a philosopher. And Paul Keeler came with Paul and Peter, like the apostles, and they came and said, "We want you." I said, "For what?" He said, "We're doing a very important study program for a cultural complex in Jeddah with Dr. Abdullah Nasif, and we want you." So I was surprised. I was just in England recently, and I found these two gentlemen coming to me outside London and telling me, "We want you to work on the cultural center." And I said, "Why me?" And they said, "We made our research. You're the only traditional architect we could find. And we as Muslims want to do this program to promote the culture of Islam." And Paul Keeler came about in Islam when he was working on He had an art gallery, modern art gallery. And he made the exhibition, he worked on the exhibition for Islamic art in London in the 1970s, 76. And he became, after that, he embraced Islam. And I met a lot of people in England, Muslims. One was Richard Williams, a very, very famous animator. He is the inventor, the creator of the Pink Panther. And I met him at Hajj. And he kept his Islam secret because of Hollywood and all that, but I asked him also, what made you go into Islam? And he said, when I saw the art of Islam. The art of Islam in 100 years became one of the most beautiful art in the history of the world. I mean, there is the Japanese, of course, which is a great art, but the relation is Shintoism, which is nature, and most of it is landscaping, flower arrangement. But basically, Islam has produced a great art. Now, why was it possible for Islam to produce a great art? Because beauty that we see is the exterior expression. It is a manifestation of the truth. And because Islam is a religion of truth, and the beauty of the poetry and the verse of the Quran has been transmitted in all other arts, in the crafts and in architecture and in calligraphy. So Islam has forced this beauty upon us and our environment. Our houses were not designed by fashionable architects that make twisted forms. No. Our houses was an interpretation of the environment of paradise. The house was the courtyard, with the gardens, with the fountains. And it was very well developed in Iran and in Syria and in Egypt, where you go in and you have the serenity, the sakina. And when you see what caused this, it is really because people say the Quran doesn't tell us how to design or do architecture. No, but it gives us a way of life that you can interpret physically in our environment, in our city and in our houses. In Allah Jamil yuhib al-Jamal. The beauty is that very strong statement of the truth behind it. And because we have today a lot of falsehood in our life, this generation has produced, the 20th century has produced more ugliness than all the 20 centuries before it. It is horrible. And you can see today it's not only producing, it's destroying instead of building. As you can see, all our cities are being destroyed, all our history, all our architecture. Unfortunately, there are some colleagues of mine who are also involved with the Aga Khan program, and they speak of Islamic architecture. And one of them came here to give for a seminar and lecture and tells me you cannot repeat the past. And this is how they detract us from the truth. We do not repeat the past. Nobody can repeat the past. What you do is you carry the past with you to be able to have a direction in the future. Because those who speak of the future, they impose the future on us. Who are they to tell us what the future is? And it always turns ugly. It's like you have to make something new religion, new fashionable designs. No, there is a logic in Islam, there is a logic, a science and a truth in every building, It is not done haphazardly because the artist is his whims. It is directed by the guidelines of Islam. And Keeler had an art gallery with all this modern art, and when he came into Islam, he realized that this art was devilish, shaitani, because it has no origin or roots. And it is based on greed, money, personal fame, individualism, all the bad characteristics that were developed through the Renaissance when the European culture lost its guidance from the Christian religion and started having churches as bingo halls. I hope we don't have our mosque at football playgrounds in the future. Paul, it's yours.
Thank you, Dr. Aisha. Thank you, Dr. Wahid.
Press on the mic, please.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Aisha. Thank you, my dear friend, Dr. Wahid. And let me start by saying that I'm very grateful for all of you to coming here this morning. Because, first of all, I'm very happy that this lecture is happening in the morning, because I'm best in the morning. As the day proceeds, I run down until by the evening it's a struggle. In the morning I love it. And when I was invited, when you sent this very kind invitation to me, I looked at this architecture, cityscape, these kind of words, and I thought to myself, I'm not an architect, I'm not an art historian, I'm not a sociologist of architecture, or a historian of architecture. How can I have people coming and giving their good time to come and listen to me talking about this subject? And then I thought to myself, well, there are two reasons why I think there is a certain benefit in it. The first is, I was born and I have existed in, all my life, architecture and the environment. I should know something about it. I've lived in it all my life. But then hold on a second, so have all of you. And so has every creature that ever was born on this earth has also lived their whole lives in architecture and the environment. So what makes my particular story special? Well, I think the reason is because I have existed and lived in quite different worlds. I was born in 1942 and I was 18 in 1960. Now, I was born of that class in England that was born to rule. That means that I went through a whole education preparing me for empire. And the environment that I lived in was an environment which also related to that caste. However, coming to 1960, our empire was in the process of being demolished. It had almost completely finished. But of course the educational system always lags behind. And at the age of 18, entering into the 60s, I then experienced a completely different world. I experienced the world where we actually spent our time demolishing the world that we'd grown up in. We were the big revolutionaries in art, because my field, from leaving school, was modern theatre, modern art, and then that final total rejection of everything that one had been brought up in when the hippies hit London in 1968. Total rejection. And each of these worlds had their architecture and environment. And I was steeped in them, deeply involved in them. And then we come to the final one, where out of this maelstrom, I call it, of chaos of the 60s, where I was drowning in a great flood, I was plucked out and beautifully introduced to Islam through, most importantly and most profoundly, its environment, its traditional environment. So that's the first reason. I had an extraordinary journey. Nothing of my making. Actually, simply in terms of the timing where I happened to be at a particular moment. I didn't plan anything. The second reason I think that there is a good point for my being standing here is that I've also not got my knowledge from books. I'm not an academic. I just completed this little book. If I was an academic, there would be 1,000 books in the back, and there would be footnotes, and it would be extremely impressive. It would be at least 5 times the size. But I haven't got my knowledge from books. There have been books that have been important in my life. And I'm not an academic who goes into every detail of the subject. I have received my knowledge from people. And I have been very privileged to be very close to and to empathize with and to gain some understanding through traditional masters, of which Abdul Wahid al-Wakil and his great teacher Hassan Fatih have been my guides in terms of Islamic architecture. So what I have done is I've prepared a little slideshow which first of all takes you through the environments that I experienced in my life that took me through into Islam. And then I want to show that once I had got to the age of 70 and I was asked to reflect, my reflection upon that world of Islam, and then my reflection upon the West, the world that I had been brought up in and had come out of. And of course, what you will find is that people will say to me very often, you paint a very rosy picture of Islam. You paint a very rosy picture. It sounds all wonderful. But look at it now. Look at the world of Islam now. So my last part, if we get to it and we have enough time, is actually trying to answer those questions of why Dar al-Islam is in such turmoil and such visual, environmental chaos. So let us begin. Part 1, Changing Worlds. I'm a child of empire from 1942 to 1960. This was the house that I was born in. And that window, which you see coming front, was the room in which my mother gave birth to the 5 children. There were 5 of us. I was number 4 in the family. And this house was a glorious realm. And one of the things which was very, very special about it was the garden. It was a large house. And the garden was the creation of my mother. And this is an English garden. And the English garden is one of the wonders. You ought to go and sit. You ought to go and sit here. Really. You're not going to see it. Are you sure? Because you're not going to spoil your name. Are you sure you're all right? Yeah? Good. Good. So the English garden for children is a glorious place because there are so many places to disappear in, to hide, to play games, hide and seek and all the rest of it. And then you're with the gardener and you're playing tricks on the gardener, and then the gardener takes you for a ride in his barrow. It was a wonderful, a glorious paradise of a place. And then the church, the local church, visited me at the age of 5. I was in love with the church as a child. And I was a servant of the church. And the church was a small one. It was a little parish church, because we were just on the outskirts of Windsor. And it was magical inside, the vestments and the colour and the beauty. It was a very beautiful environment. And for me as a child, it had a wonder. And then our home, if you see that gate, through the gates was the factory. Because my father was an industrialist. He made optical instruments. And the factory for the children, when you went into that, that was a dangerous environment. All the machines, the paint shops, the assembly lines. I spent a week in the assembly line and nearly died of boredom, having to put grub screws into the instruments. Everybody sitting there in the lines. So we had this division between the home and the factory. And they didn't mix. As the door closed on those gates, the factory was the factory, the home was the home. Two separate realms. And in the home we were free to roam. We roamed in the home, we went into the fields adjacent. The house was glorious because the house was like, oh, well, let me go to Windsor. Let me go to Windsor. Here we are at the very heart of the British Empire. And this was our town. And we needed absolutely no encouragement to go with our mother shopping, because every day we marched with the soldiers. And you see, the environment is not just the visual environment. It's the whole environment of sound. And the sound of the bands and those lovely marches, and which are coming out for a child, was incredible. But it was a very conservative town. And all the pageantry. This is St George's Chapel at the castle, the chapel of the Majesty and the Queen and the King, when it was the King during my childhood. And this is the great Order of the Garter, which goes back 700 years, and you can see all the flags. So you've got this connection between the military and the church, which is very powerful within the English environment. So this was the world that I grew up in as a child. Can you imagine the impression that makes upon you? The little creature seeing all these amazing things, the soldiers, the pageantry, etc. The home was quite extraordinary because this house was like a courtyard house. It was a central hall with the balcony going around upstairs, and everything came off this central hall. And the top was covered, but it went straight up into the light. So we had the light coming through. And of course, growing up in it, it was a magical house to be in terms of, the space. It was a very beautiful space. And always, you're going up on the landing and seeing down into the hallway, where the whole sort of life of the house revolved around that, and then all the house things were off, and then the back kitchens, everything went off the other way. So that was my childhood. And that was my family home until the age of 18, 19, 20, 21. And we had, though, in our caste, we had a terrible thing that then happened. Because at the age of 8, we were all shipped off to the prep school. And the system of education for our caste was that for 10 years we spent most of our time, first of all in the prep school and then in the public school, being prepared for empire. And it was a very harsh education. Those steps which we're standing in front of, up to the front door, will always be seared upon my memory. Because when we went for an away game, match, cricket, rugby, football, whichever one, we would come back, and if we had won, we would cheer in the bus. If we had lost or drawn, there would be silence. And if there was silence, as the bus drew up, the headmaster was at the top of these stairs, and you see him in the middle there, and he was a Scot, very tall, and he was standing there like the god of wrath, terrified. and us little boys getting out. And of course, if we'd drawn, we got a reprieve, but if we lost, there would be fury to have to contend with. And the discipline. You've all seen Mutiny on the Bounty, the kind of floggings that took place in the Navy. They took place in these schools. They took place in these schools. So this going from one to this, so this particular house, for me, which is a classical house, which was a house that then was in the late part of the 19th century was turned into a school, still holds horrors for me. I still have never been back there. And it's a place which, you know, I know I can remember every room and all the things about it. Because we were living on the edge of fear for 6 years. And I was there for an extra year because I failed, first of all, to get into my next school. I wasn't very bright. But the next school was completely different. This was like paradise. This was a school on the Southern Downs overlooking the sea, which was a part of the great Christian revival of the 19th century. Because Christianity had almost died in England by the 18th century. And then there was a great revival in the 19th century. And this was one of the products of it. Many schools were founded. And just look at the scale of that chapel. And I spent 4 very happy years in this establishment. Because by the time I got there, I had already been institutionalized. 6 years in that, I was already a part of the community way of life. And here, arts, music, theatre were all cultivated, as well as everything else. But the environment itself was a glorious environment, and this chapel, which still wasn't completed when I was at school, this west end, the west end of this part was still to be completed, it's the highest chapel in England. And the whole of our life revolved around it. Every morning and every evening we had services, and on Sunday there were 3 services. The music was beautiful. The whole thing came together in the most glorious way when there were the festivals. And the choir was one of the finest choirs in England. So one experienced that beauty in religion. It was profound. We had a remarkable housemaster, and we experienced that end of the grand tour when an English gentleman was taken to Italy. And we went with him, and we went to visit Siena, Florence, Assisi, and Venice. I was 17 at the time. And you can imagine the experience of the beauty of these places. Now, I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. My brother did, one of my brothers, but that was the normal thing. After you had completed your public school education, you went to Oxford or Cambridge. But I spent a lot of time going to Oxford. Now, of course, there's a much better reason to go to Oxford because of the Oxford Islamic Centre, which Abdul Wahid al-Wakil has built. But then it was a beautiful city, yet to be destroyed by an awful lot of stuff that's gone up since. And again, the courtyards, the gardens, the inner worlds which you got, which of course are reminiscent of a world that we're going to become very familiar with in a minute. And then our caste joined a club, the all-male clubs of London. And this was my father's, the East India Sporting Clubs. Most of them built in the classical style. So here you have, one's going in a world, one's walking around the world, in 1 minute I'm in this great Gothic environment, and then I'm in the classical environment. I didn't actually join the club because my destiny lay elsewhere. By this time the establishment was beginning to to entrench itself, that some of us were peeling off and beginning to make trouble. So from 1960 to 1968, I spent my life, as I was saying in the beginning, in the great movements in modern art, in modern literature, in modern theatre, which were standing against the establishment. And it was in the middle of these, my art gallery days, where I really experienced architecture and had another major change in perception. Because my father gave me one of his shops up in London, on the corner of Wigmore and Welbeck Street. And there I opened my gallery. Now, London, at that time in the early 60s, was full of bomb sites. It had not been rebuilt since the war. So the memory I have of going up to London as a child, right up into my early adulthood, are all these open spaces, all around St. Paul's. St. Paul's was still the highest building. St. Paul's Cathedral was the highest building in London. It was 2 or 3 years before the first tower block went out. You got the Hilton Hotel and you got Centre Point. But that's the London I knew. It was a very depressed London, because we'd only just come out of rationing and there was very little money, there was endless financial crisis. But with my gallery, my artists were mostly South Americans who lived in Paris or in Rio, and some people in New York. So the first place I traveled to was Paris. And that was incredible, because again, here you were experiencing a very ordered, very beautiful city, completely intact. Looking back on it, I remember that was the amazing thing. It hadn't been bombed. There were no open spaces. You know, there were none of that destruction that bombing leaves, where buildings are half cut and all the rest of it. This was a place where I spent a lot of time with the artists. It was so invigorating, because the cafe life was still there. Now when you sit down to have a coffee in the floor or the Dumago, you have to spend a fortune. There, we used to sit with the artists and the writers literally all day with just a cup of coffee. It was still touching that world that goes right back. And then my gallery took me to New York. And this was fantastic. This was incredible. This was like walking around New York on the ground level. It was a little bit like Paris, with the awnings and the cafes. But then you looked up, and this unbelievable experience. You felt like an ant. But my goodness, it was powerful, it was exciting. And then my gallery, basically, being involved with the South Americans. Brasilia was just in the point of being built, just being completed. When I went to the São Paulo Biennale, and we went to Brasilia, which was Corbusier's dream. A complete space where you could build everything from scratch, all coming out of one man's mind. All the different shapes, like works of art, you know, like the kind of art that we were playing with. And this was very exciting. You know, we were completely mesmerized by the excitement of it, the newness of it. This was something utterly new. And then when we came back to London, the 60s were in full flood, and we had the National Theatre being built. And this was a building again which caught our imagination. The whole modern arts world was very excited by this particular building. And it's one which I remember, how excited we were. The shapes, the different forms, the structures, you know, everything was enticing and new and fresh. But then, at the time when the chaos was beginning to overwhelm the last of the manifestations I was engaged in, which was the great hippie explosion, it was 1968-69, by an extraordinary moment, I was plucked out of that world and landed straight into the Islamic world. And I had an inspiration, which is the most important inspiration of my life. The person who had engaged me had introduced me to Mughal India. And my artists from South America were all very much in love with Iberia, with the Moorish Spain, because they were interested in the abstract nature of the art of the Alhambra and Cordoba. So I knew a little bit about Moorish Spain, and I was being introduced to Mughal India. And I realized that it was the same world. It was the same world. It had the same criteria. The calligraphy, the geometric pattern, the whole hierarchy of the arts, the hierarchy of thought, of knowledge. It was the same world. And the only thing that connected it was Islam. And I went ahead and, through my contacts that I had with the gallery, started the process of organizing a festival in London, the World of Islam Festival. This was all happening in 1971. And the festival was planned for 1976. And I got the support, all the institutions came together. And we started the process. In it, I was enabled to start to explore Dar al-Islam. And looking back on it, I realized that it was through the cities that I encountered that my love and joy of this civilization grew. The first place I went to was Damascus, 1973. As soon as I got the support for the festival, I went to Damascus. Why? St. Paul. I'd been brought up. I knew everything about the road to Damascus. When St. Paul was blinded, he has this trauma. He goes into Damascus, he goes to the street named Straight and visits and is told to go and see this holy man, the house of this holy man, where his sight is restored. I arrived late at night. Never forget it. It's a little bit eerie. Late at night, I took the taxi, everything was dark. I got to my hotel. And in those days, you know, people weren't traveling. It was the time before the new airports and the new hotels and everything. There were all the old hotels and everything. You remember? And I arrived and I went to bed and I was quite nervous. And then, in the middle of the night, like angels, the azan of the Umayyad mosque sounded. And it was the most reassuring sound. It was like something literally coming from heaven, which was totally reassuring. I've always been there. I've never left. Come and worship me. So in the morning, I got up and I went straight to the street named Straight. And in the area where St. Paul went was the area, because he went and visited a Jewish holy man, was the area until the state of Israel that had been the Jewish quarter. Never been disturbed. All through those hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years of Dar al-Islam, the Jewish quarter had never been disturbed. And as an Englishman, knowing the history of the Jews in Europe, I was amazed by this. And then I went into the Umayyad Mosque. And this was one of my great architectural experiences. To walk into the majesty of this, and yet the human quality of it. Because that's what struck me. Damascus was you felt your humanity being restored. The scale was human. New York had impressed me the excitement of New York. But it wasn't humour. It was engaging a particular emotion, which for a young person is very exciting. But here I was experiencing something completely different. Then entering the mosque. My next glorious architectural experience was the city of Fez, where Titus Burkhardt, Ibrahim Burkhardt, the architectural historian, was the UNESCO expert for the conservation of the city of Fez. So he could take me everywhere. And there again, it was not just the environment, it was the sounds. Because in those days there wasn't the perpetual music, it hadn't become a muzak. You know? It was still a serious environment. And of course the azan. Once again, that glorious azan, wherever you were in the city, you would hear it. And he took me and he took me to all the wonderful places. You know, you were going down a lane and suddenly a door would open and you were having sort of come into that L shape. You are then in this incredible world. And he took me up on the roof. We were looking across the city. And literally you could have walked across the city from one end to the other across the roofs. Everything was connected. And he said to me, you know, this place is a family monastery, which meant a lot to me and a lot to him. Because what it meant was that the whole community was living the life of worship, was living the God-centered life. The whole community. Everywhere you went, that was permeating the homes, the mosques, the marketplace. You'd find merchants sitting in there when they had quiet time with their Qurans. And that tranquility, that glorious tranquility. My next experience of the wine was a day I spent with Hassan Fatih on the build up to the festival. And he took us around. And I will remember one of the great moments when suddenly you can see, you haven't been able to see before, and suddenly they open your eyes. And we sat together and he took us into a house. And by the time he had opened one's eyes to the glory of the house, you didn't want to leave it. You can imagine why people wanted to spend their whole lives in houses. Not like today when they're empty all the time. You know, this was an extraordinary realization of the mystery and the beauty and the sanctity and the stability of the home. And then my final example, because there were many, because I was very privileged, I was able to go all over the Islamic world, was Delhi. Delhi was a city at that time of 2 or 3 million. It's now a city of 20 million. I went there in 1975. And again, I went with a dear friend who took me to all the different places. And what amazed me about Delhi was all the cities that had been created around it, which were now ruins. Because the Muslims have been in Delhi since 1206. 700 years of dynasties. And the glory of that city, the beauty of the city, the life of the city, was simply overwhelming. So the festival took place in 1976. There were 12 exhibitions, all the museums of London took part. Over 6,000 objects were collected from 250 public and private collections from 56 different countries. Can you imagine? And I had the privilege of going to these places, working with the curators, gathering in the exhibits, the beauty of it. So that by the time the festival opened and Her Majesty the Queen opened it, I was simply surrounded by Islam. But I had entered into the traditional world of Islam. And that traditional world was still alive when I went to Fez, went to Delhi, went to these places. It was still alive. Badly damaged, but it's sufficient for you to realize that something astonishing had happened. And at the end of this journey to the festival, my journey to Islam, 6 months before the festival opened, I became a Muslim. I got to that point where I saw that terrifying thing developing, where you could become schizophrenic. And you could end up your whole life studying something and being something completely different. And I wasn't like that. I wanted to be whole. And I became a Muslim. And at the end of 76, I made my pilgrimage. And here I was introduced to something which, again, one had seen, but to experience it was something totally different. Because the Kaaba, like the Azhar, is completely there, perfect for all time. It's again Almighty Allah saying, my presence. In an empty cube. Perfect geometry. I have listened to Abdul White talking about this for hours. He can go on talking for hours. You can't get to the end of the mystery of this amazing, extraordinary center where the spiritual and the material meet. The center of our world. And you know, you experience it. It wasn't until years later that I sat with Bعنوان, but you experience it. You experience that presence. And just look at the center. So then that form, that building, has, since I became a Muslim, become completely in my mind. 5 times a day, I turn towards it. It's ever present. That unchanging. Because there is no change in the hereafter. There is no change with Almighty Allah. We are going through a very transitory thing. We are going from the unchanging back to the unchanging. And that's where Darul Islam, with its arts, manifests the unchanging beautifully. But of course, it was the masters of tradition who gave me any knowledge I have to take me beyond that experience, which was an experience which I, as an individual, had. As an individual. I had an experience, and that was the limit of it. In order to take me beyond that, so that my eyes or my ears could be opened up to a greater understanding, never the understandings of the masters, but a greater understanding, it was sufficiently intoxicating for me to realize the mystery of things. I was very fortunate in the encounters that I had. And the first encounter was with the musician from Delhi, who took me around Delhi, but more importantly, took me out of the maelstrom of the 60s into the peace of Islam. And he is a traditional musician of one of the most remarkable traditions. And I have been with him for 50 years, nearly 50 years now. And I have witnessed how, with a traditional form, you can never exhaust it. You can only go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And then, he was a very good looking man in those days. I tell you, he's wonderful looking now, but he was scintillating. I mean, that fellow in Dr. Zhivago had nothing over him, you know? Omar, whatever his name was. And it was the meeting with him. It was the connection. After all, Hassan Fatih, he actually revived the tradition. It had gone in Egypt. And how it had gone was interesting, because the way that Abdul Wahid al-Wakil came to Hassan Fatih is remarkable. He wanted to study architecture. He goes to Cairo University to do so. He can study classical architecture and modern architecture. There is no Islamic course. Islamic architecture doesn't exist. So somebody introduces him to Hassan Fatih. And then a miracle occurs. Because you see, I believe that Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, during the 80s, here we have the beautiful example of the way in which the traditional materials create natural shapes which are in tune with the human. We resonate with them. How many modern architectures live in traditional houses? Because the scale and what you can do with them resonates with our souls. When we break that relationship. But it was with the series of mosques during the 80s that Abdul Wahid in the Hejaz produced this incredible series. And you must remember that this is a revival. There was no precedent for it. And the fact that it happened in the Hejaz is very important because it happened in the sacred center of Dar al-Islam. And what happened was unique in that what he did is he took, each mosque takes elements from all over Dar al-Islam and unifies them. Because you see, the incredible thing about Islamic architecture, it always took pieces and then became a part of a particular place. But there is a kind of purity about this particular group, which I believe was to do with the fact that Islamic architecture, having completely collapsed the tradition, this revival was like a pure manifestation of the heart. And I believe that once people fully understand what he did during this period, then something very remarkable could happen. Because you see, Abdul Wahid, when he went through this, he has no idea how these mosques were built, how it was achieved. Everything was against it. And it was a matter of pure inspiration. And somehow, with one or two people who believed in it, it was made possible. But the full implications of this, I believe, are still to come. Once people fully realize the miracle of this period. And I have sat with Abdul Wahid, and he said so many times, it was a miracle, it was an inspiration. And that inspiration was not from him. It's not from him. This is a very important thing in terms of the environment. This is a gentleman called Tony Milroy. And at the beginning of the 70s, he was sent by one of the British development agencies to go to Yemen, because Yemen was just opening up. And he went out there to the land of the great terraces, and he spent a few months with the farmers. And then he said to the farmers, look, you know all about this environment. You've been farming it forever. I have nothing to teach you. Please, I want to become your student. So for 4 years he studied this remarkable system where when the water comes from the monsoon, it hits the high hills, taken in by the trees, then it's trailed through the terraces, fertilizing the terraces, and then it enters into the wadis, the rich wadis below. And then as it comes into the wadis, each field is dammed, and then the watermaster orders that the dam is broken, and he goes into the next field, and then the next field, and the next field. Until finally, by the time the water has reached the final field in the valley, they have their crop. It's secured. And there we have it. A perfect system. And Tony studied this meticulously. And after 4 years, he went to make his report. And he said, these people have been farming this land for thousands of years. They have brought into agriculture every single inch of land that you can grow. They harvest every drop of water from the great monsoon and the little monsoon. Their system is such that they've developed thousands of varieties of seed, and they're always improving it. And their system of agriculture is passed on from father to son to grandson through epic poetry. It's a living system that is forever growing, and it completely is integrated into their religion and their culture. And in this fragile world of the arid lands, it should be studied by every single other arid land. It's reached the perfection of balance. And it can go on sustainably forever. And he described to me the meeting, with all the people around the table. And he said, when he'd said this, because what he said was, well, what do you say? He said, the only thing we can do to help them is to stay out, leave them alone. And he said that the meeting went silent. And they were staggered, and the chairman looked at him for about 5 minutes, and nothing happened. And then he said, do you mean to tell me that we've been supporting you for the last 4 years, and you come back here and tell me that there's nothing we can do? And he got into big trouble. They were furious, because they did not believe that there was any other route than the modernization and the industrialization of that land. So what happened? Tony Milroy went to Australia, he went to Africa, he got certain grants, and he studied the arid lands of the world. He then came back 10 years later, and everything he had warned about would happen had happened. The first thing, that the Truman Doctrine of flooding the markets with subsidized wheat, which undercuts the native crop, had happened. The wheat was flooding in from America and from Europe, and the sorghum growers on the terraces could not compete. And you've got the great beginning of the great Yemeni migration to the oil fields, and you find them as far as the Californian olive groves, so the almond places. They're all over the world now. And then the next thing happened is that because the terraces were no longer being maintained, they started collapsing. And this is a wadi with rubble this deep. All the terraces just coming, breaking down. And then they say, why wait for water? You've got groundwater, dig wells. And we're now in a situation where Yemen is fast running out of water. They have a huge water crisis. And in the place of this glorious stability, you have the outbreak of this industrialized crop of cut. Cut, which used to be a crop which people grew a bush outside their garden and just took a few in the evening. This is a little bouncer. Now it's an epidemic. It's an epidemic. It's been grown industrially. And if you grow industrially, you have to suck the water out of the ground. And you have to pour chemicals on it to keep out the insects. And now the Yemen has terrible cases of cancers of the mouth and other health issues which are coming from that heinous crop, which is sucking out 70% of their water. And a once amazing world of balance is now in a critical condition. I want to finish this particular segment with my son Ali, who was born a musician, and in his early 20s asked me and said, I want to go to Damascus to study tajweed with a master. So I said to him, Ali, how do you think you'll get on? He said, well, you know, I'm a musician. Play the violin, I can hear the notes, I can hear everything. It shouldn't be a problem, this is recitation. So he went and studied for 10 years, and then, this is at our house in Cambridge, he came with Sheikh Abdul Razak to have his ijazah. And I said to Ali, do you remember that conversation we had 10 years ago on your way to Damascus when you were leaving? He said, yes, Dad. I said, how does it look now? He said, I'll tell you. There's a very high ladder, and my sheikh is right at the top of that ladder, and I put my foot on the first rung of it. Because he had entered and been permitted through that art, through the first art and the central art of Islam, he had been permitted to enter into that world of the Quran, that ocean, that endless world that never ends. And he had taken his step into it. It had been opened to him by his master. And he was then on the route. Now very rapidly, because I've got this clock, you see, because I'm accused very often of going over the time. And I'm trying desperately, because I've seen 12 o'clock at the camera. You know, like Cinderella. I don't want to find I'm running out of the field without any clothes on or something. So, we'll continue on. When I related this story to Mahmoud Mirza, the musician, who has opened my ears, he smiled and he said, now he understands. Now he understands. The way of Mizan.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان رب المشرقين ورب المغربين فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان مرج البحرين يلتقيان بينهما برزخ لا يبغيان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان يخرج منهما اللؤلؤ والمرجان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان وله الجوار المنشآت في البحر كالأعلام فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام آمنا بالله صدق الله العظيم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
ما شاء الله.
That was my son Ali. And I think the overwhelming thing, and this was the final thing that in a sense has been my education, is that the traditional artist has to become mature. They have to learn the craft. They have to submit themselves to a discipline. And then they have to become that completed an individual, the maturity, and then they become the vehicle. Because what they reveal, what they manifest, is the soul of the Quran, not their soul. But every reciter is different, every calligrapher is different, every architect is different. But what they're actually revealing is that is beyond. And this recitation, Tajweed, is the one art form of Islam that is completely intact. And it is the most important. There's nothing more important than this art form, because it is the direct manifestation of the Quran. We hear it. We hear the Quran. And we can only hear the Quran through the masters who can manifest it. The correctness of it is incredible, the science they go through. But alhamdulillah, this is a point where I move on, because here we have, in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate, He raised the heavens and set up everything in balance, so that you would maintain justice. Therefore maintain just measure and do not transgress against the balance. And I think that in this world that we're living in, the one thing that all human beings are feeling now is this loss of balance, this disequilibrium. It's in our lives, it's in our environment, it's everywhere. And it was upon this that Dar al-Islam was formed. This was what it was for. It was to create an environment, a world of balance. And I want to propose a way in which this unfolded. And the Quran, the revelation, which throughout the whole environment, through calligraphy, and through the balance, through mirroring the balance of the creation, the cycles, the sun and moon, and everything is in cycles, everything is in a state of balance. And the architecture and the whole visual world mirrors that. And at the center, always the Quran, manifesting itself in all the different media. And then we have the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Again, the manifestation of the whole man, the complete man. And in Islamic, in Dar al-Islam, you have something which we didn't have in Europe, which is that you had a world in which the scholar, the warrior, statesman, and the merchant all belong to the same culture. They're all integrated, because they all took their inspiration from the Prophet ﷺ. The knowledge came from him, through him. The rulership, leadership came through him. And the ethics of the merchant, how you should be trusted, came through him. And here again, in the formation of Dar al-Islam, just imagine 13 years in Mecca, where the community was under siege. There was no outside. Where the most sublime Meccan surahs are revealed, and where the inner life of the Muslim is formed. There is no outside. There is no outside. So for 13 years, that life of serenity, of sobriety, of patience, all the beautiful attributes, compassion. Think of the way that the Prophet ﷺ related to the outside world in terms of compassion when he was being terribly treated. And then you had the 10 years in Medina when he was the ruler of a community. And the best of mankind at this time learnt how to live properly in community. How to relate in your families, how to relate with your friends, how to deal with disputes, how to defend yourselves and protect yourselves from the onslaught that would take place. So that after the 23 years of this mission, something incredible happened. Because when the Prophet departed, first of all, of course, there was I'm glad I removed that orange juice. That's what happens, I get too excited, sorry. First of all, what happened was, first of all, there was a collapse, which had to be raised up. And then, the world that up until this time had been in 4 parts: the Chinese, the Indian, the Persian, the Mediterranean. Within decades, there was this extraordinary expansion. Unprecedented. It happened within decades. And in Damascus, there was the center of government was established in Damascus. And just imagine running an empire that spread from Spain to India. How did they do it? How could they do that? Well, of course, what happened is that they didn't destroy the structures that existed already in terms of ordering. They took what was best and they brought Islam, and it was gradually conformed to it. It conformed to the new way, but not by destroying, by transforming. And they held that area. The administrative power was incredible. And inside that, Islam was moving through merchants and things. But an extraordinary thing happened, because you got the Dome of the Rock. The Muslims arriving in Jerusalem, the center of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Jews and the Christians, and announcing their presence with the Dome of the Rock. And again, the Dome of the Rock, an octagon. Nowadays people make mosques with octagons and in rounds and things, which is nonsense. Mosques are always rectangles. The earth, and then you have the domes, the heavens. But the octagon, that over the great rock, it's a moment of the ascent of the Prophet Muhammad on the night journey. This is the point. But it also announced the presence of the final revelation of the traditions. But what was amazing was the creation of the Islamic city. People argue about it. Absolute nonsense. The Islamic city was formed through the Muslim way of life. The Islamic way of life determined the form of the city. And indeed, every way of life determines the form of a city. Our dysfunctional modern way of life has produced dysfunctional modern cities, which are all suffering in. But this was a miracle of a structure which was formed, first of all, not inside the existing cities, but outside. The cities which were created by the new Muslim armies who settled down, and like Kufa, like Cairo, like Fustan, etc. And these are organic. But they're organic in the right places. They're organic in the right places where they are connecting They're not organic in their substance. Because in their substance, you have the mosques, you have the homes. It's only the lanes that turn this into an organic city, and the fact that each of these houses, each of these mosques is centered. It comes from the center out. And of course, all the crafts were utilized in the creation of the environment. Islam is an environment in terms of the crafts, in terms of the art, they're all coming together in the environment. Why doesn't Islam have theatre? Because life is the theatre. You don't have a separation. You have the story, because the imagination of man and woman and child can build everything. But you don't have this creation of this separate reality, because the reality is the life. It is the way of life. So the whole of the city and the countryside is a theatre. After 100 years, Islam splits. You get two great centres, Baghdad, which we know very little. You can make little sketches about it, but we know very little about Baghdad. And of course, Cordoba, which we know a great deal. But in these centres, there took place a huge intellectual work of the scholars. Because out of the Holy Quran and the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ came this massive body of actually protecting the way of life. You had to learn the way of life. Generation after generation had to learn how you lived. And they learnt it from their parents, and they learnt it from you, but also they learnt it through the great works of the scholars. And this is a mammoth undertaking which continued, and every new place that it went to, it had to respond to the new situations. But it never lost track with that absolute unchanging center. Now, there was also another massive intellectual thing that happened, and that was that from the modest town of Medina, Islam was now in control of two empires. The whole of the Persian, the richest parts of the Byzantine. And they had all the knowledge going back through civilizations, pouring into their world, because they had to deal with big worlds, big administrations. They had to deal with great cities, huge areas of cultivation. How do you do it? You have to take the knowledge. But what happened was a great sifting. They took from the philosophers of the Greeks what they required to take from the philosophers of the Greeks. They sorted everything out. They took from the doctors, from the hakims, from the knowledge of medicine. And they included that within the knowledge of the Prophet ﷺ and the knowledge of the places where they went. Because every place has a great knowledge of these things. They developed machinery, which was necessary in order to build the kind of water systems that they built for greater cities, because they were building cities. Many, many cities were created by the Muslims and transformed by the Muslims. And then we come to astronomy. And astronomy took a huge leap forward. Why? For two reasons. One is that Islam required a very precise direction to find the Kaaba. And secondly, it required a much more precise way of being able to deal with time for the prayers. So the Christians just prayed to the east, the rising of the sun. But for the Muslims, they needed knowledge, and they developed that knowledge to support the way of life. And then you take the astrolabe. They took a basic astrolabe from the Greeks. They then improved it. Because you see, another thing about the Muslim world was that it was a very mobile world. People were traveling. The merchants had a high status in the society, which no other merchants had ever had. This is the first time merchants had a high status. And also, the Muslim is encouraged to make pilgrimage. So in all of these things, Islam was traveling, Muslims were traveling, and they needed to know where they were. And they developed this amazing thing, which would give them exactitude of where they were. Works today. But, this is very important. Once they had developed it, and it had reached its full capacity, and it was doing its job, it remained the same forever. It never changed. And it never changed because in Dar al-Islam, things were developed to support the way of life, not for their own sake. And this is a very important distinction. Now, this was a picture that was given to me by one of the scholars in Malaysia, and he said here, who's done wonderful work on the merchants of Islam. He's found fantastic texts, classical texts, which deal with the whole place of the merchant and the behavior and everything. It's a wonderful work he's done. And we were trying to find one image that would somehow express Mizan, the balance. Because you see, the humanity has tendencies. The first tendency is that when Islam was so successful very quickly, within literally decades, the Muslims were very rich. What happens when wealth pours in? They became wealthy. And they were sinking. And then you got a tremendous movement from the scholars to bring them back up again, to remind them, especially the merchants. And it's from this period that you get the great classical texts which turn the merchants into the pious merchant that was literally able to take Islam all the way to Malaysia. For example, there the Alatasis have literally almost converted the people. And then the second thing that comes about, the second tendency, is one for spirituality just to take off and separate itself from the norm, from the norm. It goes off into its own world. We had this with the Batinists, we had this with a number of sects within Islam. And the scholars had to bring that back. They had to challenge that. They had to find a language in which to be able to deal with it. In Christianity it happened, in my country, and in the end it burst. It shattered 500 years ago. Because religion literally separated itself off from the world. But the Muslims knew how to deal with that. And then the scholars had to deal with legalism. When a society like the Jews, when the Jews became so legalistic, it was just what you did, and there was nothing inside. It became a husk inside. And the whole inner heart of Dar al-Islam would start shriveling, becoming hard. And they had to deal with that. And finally, they had to deal with pure rationalism. Because you see, that is a very, very powerful tendency within the human. That the mind can solve everything. That the mind becomes supreme. And you've got these movements in Islam, and they very nearly succeeded. Where the mind became the arbitrator of everything. Above revelation. It could know God. You could know everything through the mind. And they had to deal with that. Because it was that which in Europe, when the mind became king and supreme, that led humanity into this world where there is no God. There is only man's ingenuity. So this was what the Muslims were concerned about. It was mizan. It was maintaining the balance between these tendencies. And all of this work was going on during that 500 years. If people talk about a golden age, it wasn't a golden age. There was no golden age in Islam. There was only one golden age, and that was when the Holy Quran was revealed and the Prophet ﷺ was live. And that was beyond gold. But the first period was a sorting out. It was a challenging. It was providing those frameworks within which the Islamic way of life, both physically, in terms of the environment, and intellectually, could be lived anywhere on earth. And this work came to its glorious completion with Imam al-Ghazali. Everything is in its place. It's a monumental work. And he was given the name. Throughout Islam it was accepted of the proof. In Arabic, Al-Ghazali's name in Arabic? Huh? The proof of Islam. Yeah. Yeah, the proof. This is it. Yeah. He was seen as the proof of Islam. His status was unbelievable. And you see, what is so interesting, and the scholars have done this work, at the moment, when the idea is that it's after Al-Ghazali, the idea is very prominent in the Muslim mind, but after that we have the decline. And this story of the golden age of Islam and its decline after Imam al-Ghazali comes from 19th century Europe. Why? Because in the 19th century, the Europeans had got to the point where they were looking back and creating their history. And in that process of creating their history, they were the supreme triumph of humanity. They had reached the point where their vision of history was that they were the supreme. They had reached the summit, particularly in England. Particularly in England. And I know about this because this is what my education was about as a child. I was taught that we were the ultimate in terms of humanity. And then they looked at Islam. And they said, oh, they had a nice bright moment when they were all very active intellectually. So the golden age, because they were putting everything into golden ages. The golden age of Athens, golden age of Rome. That was the golden age of Islam, would be that point back in the past. But you see, it wasn't the golden age when they reached their highest point. It was the age when they were sorting everything out and the whole culture and civilization was being born and taking on its thing. Because in our story, Islam is a footnote to Western triumph. You see, now we're living in a very different situation. We're living not in the 19th century, we're living at the beginning of the 21st century, when the realization of the disequilibrium has reached the point that literally we can see the destruction of our world through many ways. The scientists who have brought us all these things is now telling us the different ways we can be destroyed, the different ways we're standing on the very edge of destruction. Why? Because we have completely lost disequilibrium. The balance is gone. We no longer have a balance between our duty towards Almighty Allah, our duty towards the community, and our duty towards the creation. And that is what Dar al-Islam was all about. That was what the scholars were concerned with. You go into the text, that's what you find. So, there followed. What followed? The Great Expansion. Just look. This was the first part. Afterwards, Islam spreads everywhere. And by the way, it's a Sunni Islam that spreads to all these outer areas, beyond. And it doesn't only spread right across Afro-Eurasia, it spreads much more deeply into the world it already exists. And that the scholars have got the evidence for as well. So you have this great deepening of Islam in the community where it is already existing. And you have this huge expansion that takes place because it is perfectly balanced. And look from east to west. And wherever Islam went, it connected into that world, into that environment. It was in a state of harmony, in a state of Mizan, with the environment and with the culture that existed there. And yet, that unchanging center of the revelation was always present. And this world, this huge world of cities, villages, nomadic tents, etc., were all held together through the great routes which connected the caravans that passed and the ships. And this created a golden web. And this golden web was so sensitive because things were traveling, and ideas would travel, crafts would travel, everything would travel and connect and relate that world which was kept together at the center by the unchanging, unmoving Kaaba and the pilgrimage of the Muslims to the holy center. Thank you very much. I saw the clock. It's coming to 11:45. This is half the lecture. So if you get the other half, you have to come back or invite me back. Can I just say something about my book? If I could just say that I've written a book which is basically the complete lecture that I gave in Cambridge, which started this whole process off. And the complete lecture gives, it gives the whole story. Because with this I've stopped at a particular moment. But I deal with the West, and then I deal with the reasons why, and there's much more in it. And it will be available on Google Books in about a week's time.
May I ask you the first question?
I've been very lucky.
You said something which is very important, and that is the art of the recital of the Quran is the only art left which has not been altered or improvised upon like architecture. Do you think that if your son did not go to a traditional shape, he would have recited the Quran with the violin in the background and saxophone?
I think that what would have happened is he would have used his own interpretation of it. In other words, but you can't do that with the Quran. But you can do it, but unfortunately, you can do it with calligraphy. And it's being done on a massive scale in Dar al-Islam. So what happens now, instead of the calligrapher learning the craft, which is huge, and then that becoming a vehicle for the Quran to be manifested physically, which means that the master has to be born. What is now happening is you have artists, modern artists, who use the Quran as a quarry. They deconstruct it, and then they create their own experience of it. And what is revealed with the traditional calligrapher is actually, you could say, it's like the soul of the Quran. What the modern artist who plunders calligraphy is doing is revealing their own souls. And unfortunately, most human beings really shouldn't do that. We are given great blessings not to reveal our souls, to present a good front, to be on a road of improvement. But unfortunately, in my society in the West, everybody's revealing their own souls. Twitter. Any idea you have, this is all coming from Freud and the idea of the deep subconscious and everything. And you've got to share everything. All your blemishes, all your ghastly things. And unfortunately, the modern artist is mirroring this trend of revealing your half-born self, which is not a pretty sight, very ugly. But what the traditional calligraphers do is revealing the soul of the Quran, and that is Mizan. When we look at those traditional calligraphers, the balance in that art form is simply glorious. And that's what it's all about, inshallah. I mean, it's about many things, but one of them is that. Is that right?
Yes, because I have an Egyptian friend calligrapher who came to England, and in order to become famous, he kept doing very funny calligraphy and saying, I'm innovative, and it's usually the market and the money and the ego and the cult of individuality that the West has produced that makes him do that.
Yes, but we have a great problem. We have a huge problem. And that is, you see, that artists are born. You know, you are born with a better sense of hearing, or being engaged with that, with eyes, you know, with the philosopher. I have a friend who's a philosopher. Philosophy is beyond me. I can't understand it. I have great difficulty understanding it. He has a mind that can grasp it. And the problem is that when you've destroyed the traditions, there's no channel for all this desire to create to gain. So when you have developed a philosophy of self-expression, we all express ourselves, then it's a great tragedy, because what can the artist do? What can the artist do? He has to create. He has to create. So this is the great dilemma we face. And in the West now, it's completely, modern art is now everywhere. And of course, the impact it's having. I always call it, the danger of modern art is that traditionally, people, when they are presented with it, actually their first reaction is, it's crazy. That's the normal reaction. It's crazy. The guy's doing it for money. Or, it's mad. But once it's actually supported by the establishment, in our society it's supported by the establishment in a huge way, then people start to doubt their own response. And they start saying things like, well, I quite like that, and then once you've got that, and then that's it. Because what's now happening is that over the last 20, 30 years, modern art has become so powerful that it's affected architecture, it's affected advertising, it's affected filmmaking, it's affected every single discipline. Because now everything has to be out of shape. Everything has, I watch a football program. It used to be quite normal. I will watch it, because I like football. I was watching this football program. Now, they have funny views. Some of the views, and then you go very, very quickly, and then it blurs. And you're watching the thing, well, what the hell is going on? I just want to see. But what happens is that as things become stranger and stranger, and the environment becomes weirder and weirder, you start normalizing the abnormal. And once you start normalizing the abnormal, the normal starts to look abnormal. And you're on a very dangerous, slippery slope. In our society, we have reached the point where gay couples can be married and they can adopt children. Now, this is something that 20, 30 years ago, no person in our society, including gays, would even have imagined was possible. Now, in the primary schools, they're being taught that this is normal. This is normal. So unless once you have destroyed the traditions, and it's only, in Islam, we are very fortunate, alhamdulillah, because that vertical axis is so powerful, it can be recovered. Look what happened with Hassan Fatih. There was no Islamic architecture at Cairo University. And the reason for this is fascinating and has to remain for another day, because it's another whole area.
سؤال؟
So, when you speak about balance, and according to the balance, barakah, God, the opposite of it is chaos. And that's what you're saying, that now is happening in the West, what we are seeing in the world, or mentioning about the marriage, and also the dysfunction that we see from the United States also. Families, basic values are slowly being destroyed. And they long to get back what they used to have 30, 40 years ago. They speak about basic values, but once you lose it, you cannot take it back. And they missed what's so important for their culture, for their future.
I think, if I may suggest, we should be much less worried about the West and far more concerned about Dar al-Islam. Because the balance here in Dar al-Islam, as we can all see, is absolutely all those tendencies which I talked about, which the great scholars of Islam for hundreds of years were dealing with. That unity, that connection, that integration is fragmenting very quickly. And we are living, the Muslims are living under a world which they didn't create. You know, the way the West unfolded is an extraordinarily interesting aspect, and this is in my book. You've got it's the concept of the three worlds. We had, and the architecture shows it perfectly. The cathedral, the great classical palace of the Greco-Roman revival, and the high-rise, the skyscraper. When you look at those three buildings, there's nothing that connects them. They're three completely separate aesthetics. And they're born out of three completely separate cultures. The Christian, the civilized, you hear this talked about the West, the civilized world. We're always using this term, the civilized world. And the modern. But they're complete cultures. And the modern completely contradicts the Christian. Completely opposite. And yet these three worlds are within the one mind of the Westerner. I, as an Englishman, have these three worlds. Now, the way that, if you like, I found peace in terms of, you know, not having to deal with that constant contradiction was in Islam. And the reason why we are very blessed is our centre is intact. And the tradition of scholarship of Dar al-Islam and the knowledge in terms of the built and cultivated environment is huge. It's oceanic. And we're not bothering to swim in it. We're not bothering to get it. We're trying to have think tanks to work out things, you know, out of our own imaginations. If you are out of balance, right, and we agree that we are out of balance, we're in a state of disequilibrium, where do you go to learn how to get back into balance? You go to those people who have done it. And our ancestors did it. When I went to fairs, it was still warm. They lived a life in which they lived a life of security, in terms of the sacred law, and in an environment which was constantly bringing people into that sense of being centered. They were never very far away from the worship of Almighty God. And they were selling in the market. All these things were happening. So, until the Muslim gets out of his mind the idea that Dar al-Islam failed, has to catch up. And actually it succeeded, and this thing that we're all now caught up in is failing. And there's no way that can succeed, because the paradise on earth that it offers, in the 50s we believed in it. Nobody believes in it now. The kids don't believe in it. They can see the future, and they can see it's bleak. And they're going to drugs, or they're burying themselves in their work so that they can, you know, not look at, or they're just having fun. And that's a fact. And the only thing that counts in this modern cult, this modern culture, is growth. Growth. And now governments are having to borrow to keep growing. In the 50s it was easy. In the 1850s, when we had the whole show, it was wonderful. We had the whole world to expand into and to take over and to grow the rubber in Malaysia, take out the tin from here and, you know, use the whole world as our oyster. Now it's full up. And the human soul is disintegrating. And the young This is one thing I can't get onto, but it's the most important. It's in my book. Childhood. Childhood is being destroyed. The children are being exposed. And up until the age of 7, as is known in our tradition, the child is in a state of innocence and has just come from the divine presence. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. The child has arrived from the divine presence. And the child during that first 7 years is in a state of being. Everything is immediate. And they're innocent, and there's no time. And then when they get to the age of 7, 8, what happens is that they enter a new phase. The neuroscientists say the brain starts to divide. They start to be able to see two sides. And that's when, in Islam, you start to teach. You don't teach them to pray until they're 7. If the parents divorce, the children remain with the mother until they're 7. And the women, traditionally, who also have this purity, who also have this sense of being, they create a band around those children. Because it's a whole woman of the society that bring up the children. Not just the mother, not just the whole. And it's like a second womb. They protect. And that child grows and they run free and their imaginations grow. And they grow up into their own beings. Now, in the West, the woman, the protection has been removed. The child goes off and is sent to the nursery, where it's surrounded by all these plastic toys which make funny noises. All the things. And they're buying more and more of these complete toys. Total toy. Toys complete. And the child comes and is very excited. And then goes more excited. And it's just like the food. You know, the sugar food, the sugar rush. To make them so that they become consumers. And the children's imaginations are taken over by the adults, and it's their version of childhood. Because when you step out of that garden, after the age of 7, we do not remember. Childhood is a great mystery, just as womanhood is a great mystery to the men. Mind you, we're less of a mystery to the women. We've always had a mother, and they know us much better than we know them. And that's been destroyed. And once you destroy that, then you are surprised when the child comes to adolescence and they're becoming addicted and they're becoming crazy. Are you surprised? You've taken their child. So people often ask me, so what do you do? I said, give them, reclaim childhood. And in the Muslim world, it's possible to do. Because the Muslim, the moment is following, just following what's happening. But that's the one single thing, because the loneliness of the modern man or woman, the isolation in the West is incredible. And there's nothing worse than that individual loneliness. When you get a situation where the grandchildren no longer play with the grandparents, and the grandparents are in homes, separated off, watching television, slowly going crazy. And where they used to sit is a television, and they used to be with the children. And why am I so concerned about this? Because I'm in my 70s. Because I have to return very soon to that hereafter, in which there is no time. There is only the timeless. There's only the timeless of the Kaaba, of the Quran. There is no time in hereafter. The children have come from that. And the old are returning. So the relationship between the grandparents and the grandchildren is the final closing of the circle, because we need them to recover that timeless innocence. We need to be in a position where the old shuffle off their worldly things and the little ones are our passport into the hereafter. There are sheikhs. This is the most terrible thing that's happening.
This is very important because we are caught in the vertex of time.
That's it.
We are caught in the vortex of time. It's like a whirlpool that is draining us. And that's when people say we cannot repeat the past, we need to have novelty. And I remember somebody who came from the Harvard School program of Aga Khan, and I was giving a lecture in Saudi Arabia, and this Saudi person said, okay, we admit you are a good architect, you do beautiful work, but shouldn't you be doing architecture in the spirit of our times? Meaning I should be modern. So I told him, what if our times do not have a spirit? So what are you talking about, the spirit of our times? Is there a spirit in our times? But this is very important, this issue of anybody.
What is the name of your book, please?
Sorry?
The title of your book.
The title of my book is Reflections of an English Muslim. And by the way, don't look for any more of my books, because this is the only one I've ever written. And I'm sure it probably will be the only one I ever write. Because the next plan is to take this whole study of Mizan with the scholars to really develop this thesis of the Mizan, because the thing that is so incredible is that there are scholars all over the world who have, really done their gold digging into different aspects, but we now need to bring it together.
You're making that issue.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Faiza Naqib, and I am a doctor in architecture. But I'm not here for architecture today. What attracted me is the word mizan, balance. Every word of your, I don't have a question. I just want to say that every word of your lecture went straight to my heart, because I am personally seeking and trying to maintain balance in every detail of my life. And I can say it's very hard, especially at this time. So thank you for this beautiful lecture. And it's very amazing to see how our world was balanced before. I hope we get to this balance again.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your lecture. I have a general question. According to your experience and to your background, what's the future? What's the future of the whole humanity? Where the whole humanity is heading for? And Islam itself, what do you think about the future of Islam in this world, in the presence of the total loss of all kinds of balances? Have you got?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Any other question? We'll answer that now.
Yes.
Thank you, Sheikh Ahmed. As a Qatari, hearing what you have said, and I've heard it a number of different times, and hearing Sheikh Abdul Wahid speak also about the same topic, but coming from this country and my experience, I feel that I live a constant contradiction daily between the esoteric message that I have and the vertical revelation and the manifestation on the ground, because everything that surrounds me is of that contradictory philosophy of modernity. Wherever I go in the city, every experience I have is of that contradictory philosophy to the one that has been revealed to us. So I live a schizophrenic life. One that on the one hand I have the revelation, on the other hand everything that my country does and plans and aspires to be is of the philosophy that the West have presented to us. So we're constantly going around in circles. We've never achieved that equilibrium or balance that our tradition calls for. So how can we get out of that cycle? Thank you.
شكرا.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two remarks, rather two questions. I am here. Yes, it's me. I really enjoyed your insights on the core and the soul of Islam. And I appreciate that we as Muslims are expanding vastly among the globe. But what is it that we are extending to humanity? What is our message? This is the most important part. So when you say we are expanding, oh yes we are. But what is it that we are, trying to say? What is our message? Yes, to treat the messages now are being perplexed. And we are living, this is becoming a reality. We are living at moments of unrest, politically, economically, in this world which you are saying that we have not created. But then again, I would also question that because we took part in the creation of the Arab world. Holding ourselves accountable is a first step into finding out the solution. You have diagnosed this brilliantly, and then when you have said the art, the modern art, is manifestation of madness, of craziness. Well, yes, I agree, but then again, I would push back and say, isn't art a translation of how we feel? So then again, it's a fast changing world. And our mind, our brain cells are expanding beyond our capabilities, beyond our understanding. So when you enter college at a first year, by the third year, the curriculum would have changed. Because they have found out something new. Thank you very much.
All right, this charming lady will end the questions here, and now you have to answer them.
Yes. You'll start with the last one. Because when I talked about the expansion, I talked about the great expansion of Islam before the modern era. Because with colonialism and the huge expansion of Europe, and then the change of the whole structure of life which took place, the Muslims have been in retreat. Not Islam. I was talking about the natural expansion that took place, which provided, because you see, when I went to Malaysia, they were talking about this business about the decline after Al-Ghazali. I said, well, hold on a second. Islam came to Malaysia after Al-Ghazali. Are you a part of the decline? And I believe you mean they are not. Because the Islam they had and the way of life they had in Malaysia was simply beautiful in that Indonesian world. It was a real example of Mizan, and until incredibly recent. And when you go through Malaysia now, you go through endless rows of palm oil plantation, the industrialization of the land. And then when you go into the cities, all you see is tower blocks. And they're putting the people in the tower blocks. And what they call the flats in the tower blocks, they call them pigeonholes. They know what they are. And the process they're going through is literally disintegrating their communities, their extended families, reducing it to the nuclear family, which is very fragile. And my friend in Malaysia said that 40, 50 years ago, if you said that a crime had been committed by a Malay, if you said a crime had been committed, 99% certain it would not have been a Malay. Now, 99% certain it is a Malay. So they're actually experiencing. But what they've come out of is a beautiful society, which is very much like the scale of Medina, of the Prophet ﷺ, the camp. They were village folk. And their connection with the land, their community relations, they have so many words for the different types of collaboration and cooperation within communities. And their beautiful relationship with Almighty Allah. This is where I really saw this very clearly. Is all engaged in the long term. Long-term relationships going through generations. Long-term relationships with your environment. And long-term relationship with your God, with Allah. And of course, the problem is that is now disintegrating. Only now. When we British came to Malaya, when we came, and I almost weep when I hear this because I carry a very big burden being English. When the British arrived, they started the rubber plantations because they wanted to make money. And the Malay would not work in them. The Malays would not work in the rubber plantation, so they had to bring in the Indians. Then they started big tin mining. And the Malays wouldn't work in the tin mines, so they brought in the Chinese. And that's how the Chinese and Indian communities, huge communities, formed. And they're now separate. In Malaysia, they've got a big problem stored up because these three communities are separate. Before, a Chinese and an Indian who traded, settled in the Malay world, would become integrated. Some would become Muslims, others would learn the language and become a part of the culture and retain their religion. It was a very beautiful world. And that's what we've got to understand. Islam produced a beautiful way of life that was completely sustainable and was sustained generation after generation everywhere. When you talk about what is the message is to do with the way of life. It's the whole way of life. It's the way of life which is not extreme. You don't work until you drop.
Yes, exactly.
You don't play. Yes.
More of that because what we are promoting nowadays is the complete opposite. And
exactly.
That's why we are creating radicals.
But that, yes, exactly.
That's why we are
that's where it comes from.
Wars.
That's right, but that comes from my world. This extreme comes from my world. Because we went from extreme spirituality to extreme humanism, and now we're into extreme materialism. And with materialism, the deeper you go into materiality, the more powers you release in the dunya.
Confusion.
In the nafs, of course, because you can't control it.
You keep saying the vertical axis, now they're making the highest buildings.
Yeah. We're trying to do it physically. Exactly. That's right. Physically, we mimic. It's like the whole modern adventure is like a kind of parody. And now the children are living, we're talking about the environment, they're living in cyberspace. Yes, they're not living in the real world. They're living in cyberspace. They're not making natural relationships. You know, it's this tragedy of humanity. But there's nothing to, the only thing that they see in the West is more, you know, there's got to be a scientific, technological solution to it. Because the only knowledge they recognize is knowledge about the material world. Right? They don't acknowledge this. This is all stories, it's make-believe, it's all, you know, it's all fantasy stuff. So the exact opposite is true. Traditionally, that is complex. This is simple. Almighty Allah has given us everything. He's given us trees where the things come and we just pick the things off. And now we're having to create them in labs. And yet there's absolutely no knowledge about this at all. So this is the problem. So in terms of what the Muslims are doing, the first thing, in terms of Dar al-Islam, I believe, is that the first thing we have to do is to reclaim childhood. No use starting with universities, you've got to reclaim childhood. But it's the universities that have got to know this and implement it. They've got to see the knowledge of it, see what's happening. And then, you know, in terms of the Mizan, take care of the traditional artists, the calligrapher, the most famous calligrapher on this planet can get about, say 70,000 riyals for his work. One of these jokers who go and take the Quran and destroy it, create everything, that they get 77 million for their piece. So how can the calligrapher survive? You have to change the patronage. So there are definitely things we can do, but step by step. The thing we mustn't do, and this comes on to your question, Sheikh Fahd, which is that we mustn't be utopian. We mustn't try and create, you know, a new Dar al-Islam, a new caliphate. No, we have to take steps, because Almighty Allah isn't responsible for the show. We're not responsible for the production. We only have our, you know, and the point is that if we just take a little step, like start reclaiming childhood, Almighty Allah will take, inshallah, as He's promised, to giant steps. So we have to think of small things to do and recognize that our tutor, the thing that we should really study is how the Prophet ﷺ trained his disciples in terms of Mecca. When they were surrounded by the Jahiliyyah. Because the Jahiliyyah that is surrounding us now is very powerful. And so we have to have huge compassion. And that is something, again, in terms of Dar al-Islam, the compassion in the Muslim soul is oceanic. And that has to be released. And once that's released, all that anger and frustration can disappear. So small steps, but don't try and change the whole system. It'll eat you up.
Can I finish this with a small anecdote? Because of the calligrapher we know, he gave me a present as a calligraphy of his model. And it was put in the building I did in Oxford, the Oxford Center of Islamic Studies. And the letter was and this was supposed to be a new Quranic painting, but all the letters mixed and like a puzzle, you have to put them together. So I told him, what's this? I don't want it. He said, why? I said, I told him, Prophet Moses didn't stutter like this. But this is, we'll give you lunch now. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and I want to really thank Dr. Aisha because I have a lot of difficulty trying to convince my colleagues that haven't been in England and haven't seen the West and haven't lived over there to stop being fooled by this crazy architecture and this crazy painting and this crazy art and this crazy music and to learn more from Islam, the art of peace and the art of serenity. And you have helped a lot both in your belief in this culture, and always grateful to you for encouraging me in England when I was having trouble convincing other people. Thank you.
Yeah.